All right, and welcome back to another CSS tutorial. It's been a little bit since I've posted a tutorial on my channel here, but today we're going to be creating a CSS parallax effect. Before we get into this little tutorial, I also wanted to announce that I'm creating another YouTube channel. It's going to be called DevTube. Click this link up here in the card or down in the description, which will take you over to that channel. I'm going to be featuring other developers on YouTube. So people besides myself to teach all sorts of things with web and development and graphics related content for free. So I'm really excited about it. There's nothing on the channel right there, but I'd love you for you to go subscribe to it right now, as we'll be adding some videos and some content there where you'll be able to learn from other folks besides myself. So go ahead and check that out. Now for this tutorial, we're going to be looking at a CSS parallax effect. It looks like this. You can kind of see here that as I move my mouse position left and right, and up and down even, we're tracking the mouse position with JavaScript, and then all the rest of it is done in CSS. The entire parallax effect is all pure CSS. So really kind of a fun effect. You can use this in lots of different creative ways. So I hope you enjoy this tutorial and learn something. And without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. All right, now the first thing you have to do is have an image that is pre-photoshopped into several different layers. Now that's beyond the scope of this tutorial, so I'm going to provide a link where you can just download the exact same images I'm working with right here for this sample. This is how you do that in Photoshop in this quick time lapse. Now, of course, this process takes a little bit of time, and I actually do have a video in my Photoshop series that shows you how you can do this. So click this card or check in the description if you're interested in learning how to do a little bit of this Photoshop graphics work. All right, let's get on to the good stuff. Just to show you the initial document setup here. So we've just got a little blank HTML sheet here, and you can see that we have a single div that's called wrap, and then inside of that div we have an item wrap, and then inside of that we have our 6 pictures. Now the organization here, this is all inside of a single folder. I've got an image folder that has each of those 6 images that I showed you where we did the Photoshop work from. Again, you can download these via the link if you want to just work from these so you don't have to do any of that extra work. And then I have the index HTML file. I've got a CSS sheet that's mostly blank. And then I've got a little JavaScript sheet, which actually has some JavaScript already baked in here. So I'll cover the JavaScript towards the very end, but we're really just going to focus on the HTML and CSS here at the beginning. So in order to create this fancy parallax effect, I have to place these 6 images sort of on top of one another, but in a different position in Z space. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to come over here to the style sheet and just start to place each one of these images one by one. But before we do that, let's just go ahead and set up our wrapper divs. So we're just going to call this one our main wrap. And just while we're working with it here, I'm going to give it a background of red, just so we can see it when we're working with it. I'm going to give it a height of 720 pixels and a width of 480 pixels. And let's just save that, and you can see it pop up there in the preview. Now, I could make this full screen. I could make it 100% width and height as well, but I'm just going to give it a container with a fixed width so we can kind of see that. Now, I want it to also give an overflow here of hidden, and that's going to make sure that the pictures that are inside of here, if they go out of bounds, they're going to be cut off. I don't want them showing out of bounds. And then I'm also going to set the transform property here. You'll see what this does in a minute, but I'm going to set this to scale, and right now I'm just going to set it to scale of 1. So in other words, all the content in here is just going to be scaled to 100%, which is default, but I'll fudge with this number in a little bit and you'll see why. All right, now I need to set up 2 variables, and these variables are really what makes this entire magic thing happen, but it's going to be --x--translate. So this is how far I want it to translate on the x-axis when we do our magic matrix, and then I'll do the same thing for the y. Okay, so I'm going to set up a y translate value, and again, we're not going to use these just quite yet, but we're going to set them up here on our main root element, as we'll be modifying these CSS variables with our JavaScript code. So right now they're set to 0, but we're going to change this value based on where our mouse position is, which will do that little magic parallax. Okay, that's enough of the initial setup here. Let's go ahead then and start placing in our items. So we're going to go ahead and say item wrap, and I've got 6 images in mine. You don't have to have that many layers in yours. You can have 3 or 4. Doesn't really matter. I'm just going to set the height and width to 100%. And that looks good for now. Now there's 2 other properties we're going to come back and add in here, but I don't want to add those yet because I want to show you what they do. All right, so now we're just going to add in each of our pieces, if you will. So if you recall, we come back here and we look at our index. These 6 divs each have 2 classes. They all have a single class of face, and then they each have their own class. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So this face will allow us to do some common elements, and then we're going to use these individual classes to move these things around in a 3D space. So let's create that common one first. So we're going to say face, and let's just go ahead and set this to display of flex, because they're all going to be flex items. We want to align items. We'll just say center, and let's go ahead and justify the content to center. This is just going to center each of those images inside of our face element. We're going to set the width to 100% and the height to 100%. Again, we can't see any images quite yet because we haven't loaded those yet. We're going to set position to absolute, and then that looks pretty much fine there. We really don't need anything else. We're going to add 1 or 2 properties into this, but again, I want to add some images so you can see what happens. Okay, so save, make sure nothing broke. Now we'll come in and actually add the images. So we're going to do 1. I'm just going to do 1, then I'll copy and paste this a whole bunch of times. So I'm going to set the actual image. So I'm going to say background, and we'll set that to a URL. And this is going to be in my images folder, and it's going to be my 01.png. Now again, we used PNG images because we need that transparency. I'm going to set the background size. Well, before we do that, let's just save, and you can see, sure enough, our image pops in there. There's our first image. That's the sky image. But you can see it's huge. So I want to change this and cover it down. So we're going to say background dash size is cover. So cover, again, is going to make this thing be resized automatically to fit within its bounds. So there's the sky image. That looks good. You can see I've still got that big bright background there. That's coming because it's a transparent PNG, so that looks great. And then we're going to set this guy to have a transform property, and this is one of the magic ones. So we're going to use this translate Z. So Z for the Z axis, so that's the one that kind of goes through. You can imagine if I shot an arrow right through the middle of my picture right here, and the arrow went through it, that's the Z axis. So right now I'm just going to translate this to 0 pixels because it's my first image. And I'm also at the same time going to set a scale transform of 1. Okay, so that didn't really do a whole lot there, but that's what we need for our first image. Okay, now I'm going to grab this guy and I'm going to copy it one more time. I'm just going to copy and paste. So I'm going to call this one 2 and switch out my image to 2 and save. And you can see, sure enough, I've loaded up my second image. So I'm working backwards, right? This is the farthest away from me. This is the next closest, and we'll keep working our way towards this. So I'm just going to now copy this and do this a couple more times. So this one right here is going to be the class of 3 and o3.png. Looks good. A couple more. So this one will be 4, and it's going to be o4.png. Then we have 5 and o5.png, and then our last one is 6. So 6 and 6. And again, you don't need this many, it's just kind of however many you have. Depends on your image. So 6 and 6. Okay, so let's save that, and you can see all of those images now come in nice and pretty, and it looks great. But right now, they're all on the exact same translation. In other words, they're not being pushed back and forth on that Z axis. So we need to change these values, this translate Z value. And the number here, there's not really a magic science. It's just kind of relative. So for example, my number 1 image is way, way back there. That's the sky. Then the mountain is number 2. It's pretty far in the distance. And then this is number 3. And then my grass here is 4. This person is number 5. And this foreground grass is number 6. And what I'm getting at here is 6, 5, and 4 are all pretty close to one another if you think about relative distances, right? They're maybe, I don't know, 20 yards, right? Between this little distance right here. Now, of course, this grass goes way out here, clear up there where it's, more a couple hundred yards. But they're pretty close comparatively relative to the person and the mountains, or the mountains and the sky, which goes way back, right? So you want to keep those relative distances in mind when you're setting up how far you want to translate them along the z-axis. Because the further you push them along the z-axis, the more they're going to parallax, the more they're going to move. So you can kind of, fudge these numbers and play around a little bit. There's not a science here. Again, just keep that thought in mind. So I'm going to set my first one to 0. I'll set my next one to 200 pixels. I'm going to push it 200 pixels that way. Inward, you can sort of think. I'll set this next one maybe to 600 pixels. And then that's kind of this plane right here. Now the trees and that are fairly close, so maybe I'll just set this one to 700 pixels. And then we'll go up to, 800 pixels. And then like 1,000. We'll just, between 0 and 1,000 works for me. So I'll set that one to 1,000. So now it doesn't look like anything changed, and that's because this scale value has been applied to all of these. If I delete the scale value, these things will be pushed back and their scale will be all off. And that's when we do these transformation values. So the scale value is going to be important here. Set the scale all the way back to 1 when we push them back and forth along the z-axis. Now we need to come back here to our face property and add in this extra one I was going to tell you about here. So we want to turn on not the face one yet, but the item wrap. And we're going to turn on this property called transform style. Actually, we need transform origin, so let's grab that one while we're at it. This is going to be center and center. In other words, when we do our transformation commands, it's going to be happening at the center of the image, not on one corner or the top right or something like that. And then we're going to add a transform style. And this is going to be set to preserve 3D. And then we need this for this parallax effect to happen. Okay, so we've got all those in place. Now we can come back here to the face. And we're going to add one more in here. This is called back face visibility. We're going to set this to inherit. Now we actually don't need this in this sample, but back face visibility basically is when you have items that are in a 3D space like we're working with in here, this will determine if the back of the face is transparent or visible or not. So in our case, they are all stacked on top of one another, so it doesn't really apply, but this is always a good thing to add in here. When you're working with 3D, pay attention to the back face visibility property. Okay, so we've got everything in place, and now we can actually show you this rule that's going to control how this works. So we're going to add one more rule in here. I'll just drop it here in the middle, and this is really the magic one. So we're going to just say wrap, hover, space, item wrap, and I'll explain this selector. In other words, when we hover on top of the wrap, this is being applied to all of the items, right? So this is being applied to each individual item wrap, all the item wrap, which is again this guy, when we hover on top of the wrap. So that's when this thing gets triggered, if you will. All right, so now we're going to actually do the transformation. So we're going to say transform, and we're going to do this property called rotate 3D. And what rotate 3D does is it basically does each of these properties in one declaration. So I can rotate X, Y, and Z in a single rule instead of declaring it 3 separate times. So we're going to select the rotate 3D property here. And then I have to tell it how far I want to rotate, essentially. So we're going to add in, we'll just do some values here. So we're going to say 0, 1, 0. So that's your X, Y, and Z. That's your 3 axes there. And then we're going to say how far we want to rotate for our next one. So just for a demo here, I'm just going to say like 20 degrees. Okay, 20 DEG for right now. We'll just hard code in a value. And you can see, now you can actually see what happens. When I hover my mouse over, notice how each of those individual child elements are rotating 25 degrees. Okay, if I put this at something really much smaller, we'll say 6 degrees. And come back in here, you can see they're rotating quite a bit less. Now they're only rotating 6 degrees. And if I was to put this like at 45 degrees and come in here, you can see they're really rotating. Those other ones completely go off. I can't even see them anymore. And that's because we have that overflow hidden, right? I don't want things to appear over here. That's why we set that. So that is, again, we're rotating on the y-axis, right? So we want to rotate on both the y-axis and the x-axis. So let's add another one of these commands here. So I'm going to grab this and just copy it and just paste in another rotate. And we're just going to switch these numbers here. So we're going to say 1, 0, 0. So now we're rotating on that x-axis. And again, we'll just do, maybe I'll do 25 degrees here and 10 degrees here. Okay, let's save and refresh. So now when I hover over, you can see it's rotating on both axes, the right and the left axis, right? Each of those image. Of course, it kind of looks really crazy right now, but that is happening. Now, the next little bit of code is going to be where we introduce our JavaScript. So you can kind of envision, what if I take my current mouse position and I rotate these things, not a set degree, not exactly 10 degrees, but an amount based off of the distance my mouse is away from the center point. In other words, if I move over this way a little bit, I can rotate negative. If I move this way a little bit, I can rotate positive. If I move this, negative, this way, positive. And the more my mouse moves away from the center point of this image, the more rotation I can apply, or the less rotation. It's kind of up to you, right? How much the effect you want. So what we can do with JavaScript then is we can get the current position of the mouse as it relates to the parent container in X and Y coordinate. And then instead of hard coding these values here, we're going to use these two properties, our X translate value and our Y translate value, to dynamically add in this via CSS variables. And JavaScript can control CSS variables. So this is really an entire CSS exercise. The only thing we're really doing with JavaScript is just getting the current mouse position, because that's not something we can do in CSS directly. So let's go ahead and do that. So now what we need to do instead of hard coding this value, I got to delete the 10, and I've got to replace it with the variable, which is our --x translate value. And we're going to move this to, we'll set it to a default of 0. And then we're going to say times 1 degree. And the reason why we're doing a times here is we have to do a calculation. So we're going to say calculate. And I know this is getting a little bit messy. I need missing one more. There we go. I'm going to pull this over so we can kind of try to see that on one line. But that's what we need. Okay, we're rotating 3D again. This is the amount. But we're taking whatever that X translate value is, multiplying it by 1 degree, a calculation, because this is just going to come in as a number. So we have to do this CSS calc, so it turns it back into a degree. And that's pretty much it. Okay, so I'm going to copy that. I'll paste that back over here. I've got to fix this and change the, whoops, did I paste that in the right spot? I did not. So I've got to grab this and paste it right there, replace that. Okay, now I can put a semicolon here at the very end of that to finish off that rule. Okay, so we've got rotate 3D for the X, we have rotate 3D for the Y. Now we can move over to our JavaScript. So nothing's going to happen here when I move my mouse over because those values are currently 0. So it's basically not rotating at all. So let's go ahead and jump in. Whoops, I've got to switch this. Yours shouldn't rotate. Mine is because I have my JavaScript linked up. I got to switch this back to the Y. There's a mistake. So that one's the X translate. That one's the Y translate variables, which are currently set to 0. All right, now I'm not going to type out all this JavaScript. I'm just going to leave this here, and you can pause the video to type out all this JavaScript. I'm just going to explain it really quick. So this first rule here is just grabbing the container, right? That's our wrapping element right here. So we grab that wrapper. We also grab the inner wrap because we have two separate wraps, right? We have our outer one and our inner one. So we grab those things with JavaScript, and then we call this function .getBoundingRectangle, and that's going to give us the rectangle dimensions that wrapping container is. Okay, and then we just say, where's the center of the image? Again, we need to find this center point right here. So we're saying, okay, take that width divided by 2, take the height divided by 2, as an offset from the top and left, and that's going to give us an X and Y value that is right in the center. And then here's our event listener. So whenever we move the mouse, we set up an event listener, and inside of that function, we get the current X and Y value from our mouse, and we set that to a variable. And then here's where we're just basically setting that CSS property. You can see we grab that container element. We're setting the style of the XX translate to whatever our mouse is. So I'm going to, notice I have this console.log down here. So I'm going to right click over here and inspect this, and you'll be able to see this when I switch over to my console. And you can see as I move, you can see the X and Y values. This is actually just the X one I'm logging here, but the X value increases and decreases, based off where the mouse is. And I could also log Y if I wanted to. I could log the Y calculation right there, but we don't need to. And the amount of parallax, or how far, is determined by this little 0.02. Now you can fudge these numbers all over the place and sort of make this how you want. Maybe I want it to take that value times 0.1 or 0.01 if you want less of movement. So this is going to control essentially how much parallax movement you're going to get when you hover your mouse around inside of the image. I'm going to delete that console because I think you get the idea there. So anyway, you can see now at this point, we're getting this little parallax effect happening here. Now mine is actually pulling from the top left, so I think I'm missing something. This should pull from the center. So let's go back here and look and see what we're missing. So let's jump over here to our CSS sheet. And we'll save here. Oh, it's actually working now. There we go. I'm actually not sure what happened, but I haven't changed anything, but it's now behaving correctly. So you can see when I move my mouse in here, I'm at the center point. There's no translation. And as I slide from the center point in either direction, I get this really cool sort of skewing parallax effect that happens. Now the problem here, you can see I've still got my red background there. So let's go ahead and switch this to black because we don't need that anymore. And the issue here is that, I'm sliding over here, but I really don't want to see these edges. So what we have to do is we have to go, this is why we set up that initial scale property. Because really what I want to do is I want to zoom in a little bit. That way I have a little bit of wiggle room towards the edges, on the edges, for this thing to parallax. So we'll come over here and I'm going to set this scale to like 1.3 or something. I'm just making up a number here. And now it zooms in a little bit to my picture. But now I have a little bit of area where I can move around left and right and up and down. And, I can pull up, I can pull this way, I can pull this way. And if you go too far, you're of course going to see those parallaxing layers. But it's really cool because this entire thing is done with CSS. So there's no JavaScript that's moving these objects around. It's very, very performant. These are very high resolution PNGs and it just animates them buttery smooth. And because it's CSS, it's going to render on your GPU. So this is going to be an excellent, smooth animation as if instead of having a JavaScript movement here for parallaxing. So doing this in CSS is pretty slick. You can sort of hopefully imagine all the different creative things you can do with this little trick of parallaxing, where you move things along Z-axis and use the rotate 3D property based off mouse position. You can do some really clever things. But that is the essence of this little tutorial. I'll leave it here for you to then come in and play around with these values, tweak your numbers a little bit, mess around with your JavaScript variables. Again, you can set this to like 0.05 and 0.05 if you want. And you're going to get a little bit, you can see how much more it's moving at this point. I'm just moving my mouse a teeny bit, but this is really sliding around. So obviously that's way too much. I can go clear down to 0.01, 0.01. And now larger movements don't affect it as much. So this probably makes a little bit more sense for this image because I'm working in a portrait image. I specifically chose a portrait one that's up and down because I don't have the real estate to do a landscape image in a demo like this. But anyway, you sort of get the idea there. So really kind of cool effect. JavaScript, minimal. Most of this work's done in HTML and CSS, and you can parallax to your heart's content with a few tips and tricks. I hope you enjoyed the tutorial. I look forward to seeing you in the next one and I hope you learned something.